Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide extraordinary secrets and every gentle conversation may conceal a deeper truth. Tonight's tale follows Miss Marple as she uncovers mystery not through force, but through patience, observation, and the smallest human details others overlook. Settle in, relax, and step into a world of cozy suspense, soft whispers, and a mystery waiting patiently behind the curtain to be revealed. Chapter 1. The first whisper reached Miss Marple long before she ever saw the curtain itself. It came, as most important things in St. Mary Mead did, folded neatly into casual gossip and served alongside sponge cake. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer across the small tea table and said in a voice meant to sound harmlessly amused that Rosebank Hall was putting on rather more than a play this year, which in village language suggested complications far more interesting than amateur theatricals. Miss Marple listened with polite attention, her head slightly inclined, her expression mild and encouraging, though her eyes remained quietly alert. She had learned long ago that gossip was rarely malicious at its beginning. It was simply observation without structure, waiting for someone patient enough to arrange it into truth. Rosebank Hall stood at the edge of the village, like an aging actress determined to maintain dignity despite the passing years. Its pale stone walls glowed softly beneath the afternoon sun as villagers arrived carrying costume boxes, sheet music, and an unmistakable air of cheerful importance. The annual charity performance was the pride of St. Mary Mead, raising funds for church repairs and providing weeks of conversation afterward. Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Bantry along the gravel path, noting how even before entering, people lowered their voices slightly, as though the house itself demanded discretion. Inside, the scent of polish, old curtains, and freshly brewed tea mingled warmly. Volunteers hurried about with nervous energy, greeting one another with exaggerated enthusiasm that concealed small anxieties. Miss Marple paused near the entrance hall, allowing others to pass while she observed. She noticed who greeted whom warmly, who avoided eye contact, and who appeared to watch rather than participate. Such distinctions often mattered far more than spoken words. Mrs. Eleanor Ashcombe soon appeared, elegant in a restrained manner that suggested lifelong discipline. She welcomed guests graciously, yet Miss Marple noticed something curious almost at once. Eleanor's gaze drifted repeatedly toward the stage doors at the far end of the hall. Not proudly, as a hostess admiring preparations, but anxiously, as though expecting interruption. Each time laughter rose nearby, Eleanor smiled half a second too late. "Dear Miss Marple," she said warmly when introduced, clasping her hands with careful composure, "you must forgive the chaos. Theater brings out the worst organization in everyone." Her tone was pleasant, yet her fingers felt cold despite the warm room. Miss Marple remarked kindly that village productions were always delightful, precisely because of their imperfections. Eleanor agreed, though her attention flickered again toward the stage curtains, visible through the open doorway beyond. Rehearsal chatter filled the air. Mrs. Linton complained loudly about costume fittings while praising her own dedication. Young Clara Bennet rehearsed lines under her breath near the piano, her voice trembling slightly whenever footsteps approached. Gerald Ashcombe arrived moments later, charming and confident, greeting everyone with easy familiarity. Yet Miss Marple observed how conversations subtly shifted when he entered. Laughter grew louder but less natural, and Clara suddenly forgot her lines altogether. Tea was served in delicate cups that rattled faintly against saucers as people spoke. Someone mentioned rising expenses for the production, and another replied too quickly that Eleanor's generosity always saved the day. A third voice added that maintaining Rosebank Hall must be terribly costly nowadays. The remark lingered longer than politeness allowed. Eleanor stirred her tea without drinking it. Miss Marple listened quietly, filing away each comment. Villages rarely invented financial rumors without cause. She noticed Eleanor change the subject with unusual haste, asking about lighting arrangements instead. The diversion worked, yet her relief seemed disproportionate to the conversation itself. A sudden murmur rose near the stage entrance. Gerald stood close to Eleanor, speaking in low tones. Miss Marple could not hear the words, but she observed posture. Gerald leaning forward insistently, Eleanor rigid, her smile fixed and strained. When Miss Marple approached, both fell, instantly silent. Gerald stepped back with a laugh that arrived too quickly, while Eleanor adjusted her gloves, though they required no adjustment. "Only discussing rehearsal schedules," Gerald said lightly. Of course, Miss Marple replied gently, as though the explanation were entirely satisfactory. She had learned that denial often revealed more than confession. Rehearsal began shortly afterward. Chairs scraped softly as villagers settled to watch. The stage curtains, deep crimson and slightly faded, hung heavily across the small platform. Miss Marple noticed Eleanor standing unusually close to the curtain ropes, supervising personally rather than leaving matters to the stagehands. The play proceeded with charming awkwardness until, midway through a scene change, the curtain jammed with a harsh dragging sound. Conversation halted. One side sagged unevenly, exposing part of the backstage area. A stagehand hurried forward, apologizing profusely, but Miss Marple's attention rested entirely on Eleanor. The woman had gone pale. Not embarrassed, frightened. Her hand gripped the chair beside her as though steadying herself. For a moment she seemed unable to breathe. Only when the curtain was freed did color slowly return to her face. She laughed then, a bright artificial sound that convinced no one attentive enough to notice. "Old mechanisms," Eleanor said, "always temperamental." Yet Miss Marple saw her glance behind the curtain with unmistakable apprehension, as though checking that something remained hidden. Rehearsal resumed, but the atmosphere shifted. Lines were forgotten more often. Gerald watched Eleanor with narrowed attention. Clara missed her entrance entirely and apologized repeatedly. Miss Marple reflected that tension behaved rather like a draft in an old house, invisible, yet everyone felt it. During a brief pause, a young stagehand approached Mrs. Bantry carrying a coil of rope. He spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. "Funny thing," he said. "Some props were moved last night, not where we left them." "Perhaps tidying," Mrs. Bantry suggested. The boy shook his head. "No one admits touching them." Miss Marple pretended interest in her teacup while listening carefully. Objects rarely moved themselves, and secrecy over small matters often indicated larger ones. She later wandered casually toward the stage under the pretense of admiring scenery. The curtain fabric felt thicker than expected when she brushed it lightly with her fingertips. There was a faint unevenness near the seam, as though altered or handled recently. She said nothing, merely noting the detail. Clara Bennet approached then, clearly nervous. She asked Miss Marple whether audiences in villages were usually kind. Miss Marple assured her they were forgiving but observant, a remark that caused the girl to glance instinctively toward Gerald, who stood speaking with the solicitor, Mr. Henry Pike. Mr. Pike's expression appeared strained. He wiped his spectacles repeatedly while Gerald spoke in a low, controlled tone. When Miss Marple passed nearby, conversation ceased at once. Mr. Pike nodded stiffly, avoiding her gaze. Such silences, Miss Marple thought, were rarely accidental. As evening light softened through tall windows, rehearsal concluded. Eleanor insisted on personally ensuring the curtain was drawn properly before anyone left. She checked the folds twice, smoothing them with careful hands. For a moment she stood alone before it, her expression thoughtful and troubled. Miss Marple watched from across the hall, unnoticed. Eleanor's lips moved slightly, as though rehearsing words meant for someone absent. Then, she turned quickly when footsteps approached, her composure restored. Guests gathered coats and exchanged cheerful farewells. Outside, dusk settled gently over the gardens. Mrs. Bantry chatted happily about costumes, while Miss Marple walked beside her in reflective silence. At the gate, Miss Marple paused and glanced back toward the illuminated windows of Rosebank Hall. Through one opening, she saw Eleanor again, standing near the curtain, speaking urgently to Gerald. His posture appeared impatient, hers resolute. The curtain behind them stirred slightly, though no breeze touched it. Miss Marple folded her hands together thoughtfully. Curtains, she reflected, existed for a very particular purpose, not merely to begin performances, but to conceal what must not yet be seen. And as they walked home beneath the quiet evening sky, Miss Marple smiled gently to herself, already certain that whatever troubled Mrs. Eleanor Ashcombe was not theatrical inconvenience at all, but something hidden carefully behind velvet folds, something that had caused fear strong enough to slip, just for a moment, into plain sight. Chapter 2. A curious thing about village theaters, Miss Marple often reflected, was that the real drama rarely occurred upon the stage. It unfolded instead in corners where people believed themselves unobserved, beside teapots, behind costume racks, or within the comfortable untidiness of green rooms where politeness loosened its collar. On the morning following rehearsal, St. Mary Mead buzzed with cheerful anticipation for the charity performance. Yet beneath the excitement ran a quieter current of speculation. Mrs. Linton declared loudly at the bakery that the production would be far more exciting than last year's dreadful operetta, which, translated from village language, meant something interesting had already gone slightly wrong. Miss Marple heard this remark while selecting seed cakes and accepted it as one accepts weather forecasts, not entirely reliable, but rarely meaningless. By afternoon, she found herself once again at Rosebank Hall, invited to observe rehearsals more comfortably from indoors rather than the drafty audience chairs. Mrs. Bantry insisted she must see the preparations properly, though Miss Marple suspected her friend simply wished for company while gathering further gossip. The green room lay behind the stage, warm and crowded, filled with mirrors framed by small lamps that cast flattering light upon anxious faces. Costumes hung from rails, releasing faint scents of starch and lavender. Actors moved about with restless energy, rehearsing lines, adjusting collars, and discussing trivial matters with exaggerated seriousness. Miss Marple settled quietly into a chair near the wall, her presence quickly forgotten, a position she considered most advantageous. Mrs. Linton dominated conversation almost immediately. She complained about alterations to her costume while lowering her voice just enough to invite curiosity. "Everything has changed lately," she said, stirring her tea vigorously. "Miss Ashcombe has become quite secretive. Even the solicitor has been visiting at odd hours." Several heads turned at once. Miss Marple noticed Clara Bennet freeze momentarily while fastening a ribbon at her sleeve. The girl's hands trembled slightly, though she smiled when someone addressed her. "Legal matters are dreadfully dull," Clara said too quickly. "Dull, perhaps," Mrs. Linton replied, "but wills are never dull." The word lingered in the air like an unexpected draft. Miss Marple watched reactions carefully. Gerald Ashcombe, seated nearby, laughed lightly, though his fingers tightened around the script he held. "My aunt enjoys reorganizing things," he said. "It gives her purpose." His tone sounded casual, yet Miss Marple detected irritation beneath it, the faint sharpening of voice one heard when patience wore thin. At that moment, Eleanor herself entered the green room. Conversation shifted instantly towards safer subjects. She greeted everyone warmly, though Miss Marple observed how her eyes moved quickly across faces, as though measuring mood rather than offering welcome. She asked Clara whether she felt prepared for opening night, but her attention wandered repeatedly toward the stage door. A small incident followed, insignificant at first glance. A script lay misplaced upon a chair near the curtain entrance. Eleanor picked it up absently, then paused. Her expression altered almost imperceptibly before she closed it and handed it to Gerald. "You dropped this," she said. Gerald hesitated a fraction too long before accepting it. Miss Marple noted the hesitation. Soon afterward, Eleanor excused herself to speak with the lighting assistant. The room relaxed immediately in her absence. Mrs. Linton leaned closer again. "I hear she has changed arrangements entirely," she whispered. "Imagine altering everything at her age." "What arrangements?" someone asked. Mrs. Linton shrugged meaningfully. "Money, dear. It is always money." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Financial gossip possessed remarkable persistence in villages because it often rested upon observable truths, unpaid bills, delayed repairs, or anxious expressions mistaken for pride. Clara rose suddenly and crossed the room toward the costume rack. A folded paper slipped from her script unnoticed by most, though not by Miss Marple. The girl quickly retrieved it, glancing around before tucking it into her pocket. Her cheeks flushed faintly when she realized Miss Marple had seen the movement. "You must be terribly nervous," Miss Marple said kindly. "Yes, no. Only rehearsal worries," Clara replied, her voice uneven. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly, but said nothing more. Young people often revealed more through relief than questioning. Rehearsal resumed shortly thereafter. From her seat, Miss Marple observed entrances and exits rather than dialogue. Gerald moved confidently across the stage, yet his attention drifted repeatedly toward the curtain mechanism. Twice he stepped behind it without necessity, emerging moments later with forced nonchalance. During a short break, the vicar's wife entered carrying fresh tea. She spoke with cheerful importance. "I nearly walked into Miss Ashcombe last night," she announced. "Past midnight. Arguing with someone in the corridor." "Arguing?" Mrs. Bantry asked eagerly. "Well, speaking firmly," she corrected, clearly pleased by the distinction. "Something about documents that must never be seen. I couldn't help overhearing." The remark produced immediate silence. Gerald busied himself rearranging props, though none required rearrangement. Miss Marple reflected quietly that secrecy rarely survived shared walls. Later, while actors rehearsed a complicated scene change, a faint scraping sound came from behind the curtain. A stagehand emerged carrying a bundle of ropes, muttering that someone had altered their arrangement again. "We set this yesterday," he said. "Now it's tied differently." Eleanor insisted it must be simple confusion, though her tone carried strain. She personally inspected the ropes, smoothing them with careful precision. Miss Marple noticed how her hands lingered near a particular section of fabric longer than necessary. When rehearsal ended for tea, Miss Marple wandered gently toward the curtain area. The lamps cast soft shadows along its folds. There, half hidden between layers of velvet, she noticed faint chalk markings, not stage directions but small crosses, as though indicating position. Someone had marked the curtain deliberately. She did not touch them. Instead, she returned to her seat just as Clara approached her again, clearly troubled. "Do you ever feel," Clara asked quietly, "that people pretend everything is ordinary when it isn't?" Miss Marple considered before answering. "My dear, people often prefer comfort to truth. But truth has a habit of waiting patiently." Clara nodded, though worry remained in her eyes. As evening approached, Gerald announced he must leave early, claiming business in the nearby town. Yet moments later, Miss Marple saw him slip back toward the stage after collecting his coat, glancing around to ensure no one watched. His footsteps faded behind the curtain. A few minutes passed. Then Eleanor entered from the opposite side, unaware of his presence. Her expression softened briefly when she believed herself alone. She reached toward the curtain seam and pressed something flat against it, perhaps checking for an object hidden within. Gerald emerged suddenly. Their conversation was hushed but intense. Miss Marple could not hear words, yet Eleanor's posture remained firm while Gerald's gestures grew impatient. At last, Eleanor shook her head decisively. Gerald stepped back, his smile returning only when others approached. The rehearsal ended soon afterward. Actors departed in cheerful groups, their laughter slightly forced after the day's tensions. Miss Marple lingered near the doorway, watching Eleanor lock the stage entrance personally. Outside, twilight gathered across the lawns. Mrs. Bantry spoke animatedly about costume mishaps. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts remained elsewhere, on ink-stained cuffs, hidden notes, altered ropes, and a curtain receiving far more attention than scenery required. As they reached the garden gate, a stagehand hurried past carrying discarded papers toward the rubbish bin. One scrap slipped free and fluttered near Miss Marple's shoe. She picked it up absent-mindedly. Only part of a sentence remained visible. Meet behind the curtain after rehearsal. The rest had been torn away. Miss Marple folded the scrap carefully and returned it without comment. Her expression remained gentle, almost amused, yet her mind moved steadily through possibilities. Performances, she reflected, depended upon timing, entrances arranged precisely, exits carefully planned, and secrets concealed until the proper moment. And as the lights of Rosebank Hall dimmed behind them, Miss Marple felt quite certain that someone in St. Mary Mead was rehearsing not merely a play, but an encounter meant to remain unseen, an encounter waiting quietly behind the curtain, where polite society rarely looked until it was far too late. Chapter 3. It was generally agreed in St. Mary Mead that the most reliable news did not come from newspapers, but from teacups. Miss Marple often said nothing at all while listening, which encouraged others to speak freely, believing silence meant agreement rather than attention. On the morning after rehearsal, the village calf hummed with an energy that felt unusually sharp, as though conversation itself leaned forward in expectation. Mrs. Harmon, who ran the establishment with efficient cheerfulness, announced to no one in particular that Rosebank Hall must be costing a fortune to maintain nowadays. The remark drifted across tables like steam, subtle, but impossible to ignore. Miss Marple sat near the window, where pale winter's sunlight softened every surface. She stirred her tea slowly, watching reflections rather than faces directly. Across the room, Mrs. Linton spoke animatedly to two companions, lowering her voice only at the most interesting moments. "They say repairs alone are dreadful," Mrs. Linton whispered. "And yet Miss Ashcombe insists on funding everything herself. One wonders how long such generosity can continue." Her companion replied, "But she has always been wealthy." "Has been," Mrs. Linton corrected gently, emphasizing the past tense just enough to stir curiosity. Miss Marple noticed Mr. Henry Pike, the village solicitor, seated alone nearby. He held a newspaper, but had not turned a page in several minutes. His spoon circled his teacup long after the sugar dissolved, a small, restless motion that betrayed distraction. When Eleanor Ashcombe's name arose again, his hand paused mid-stir, then resumed with forced calm. Such reactions interested Miss Marple far more than spoken statements. Mrs. Bantry arrived moments later, breathless with enthusiasm. She declared the rehearsal charming, but oddly strained, a phrase Miss Marple considered particularly accurate. The conversation turned naturally toward theater matters, though again finances slipped quietly into discussion. "I heard," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "that lawyers have been visiting Rosebank rather frequently." Mr. Pike folded his newspaper sharply. "Legal business is entirely ordinary," he said, his tone polite yet defensive. "Of course," Miss Marple replied gently, offering him a reassuring smile. "Ordinary matters often require the greatest care." He nodded, though his expression remained troubled. After a moment he excused himself, leaving his tea unfinished. Miss Marple watched him depart, noting the haste with which he avoided further conversation. Clara Bennet entered the calf shortly afterward, cheeks flushed from the cold. She greeted everyone politely, but seemed distracted, scanning the room before choosing a seat slightly apart. A folded note appeared briefly in her hand before she tucked it quickly beneath her glove. Miss Marple observed without staring. Young people rarely concealed worry successfully. It lingered in posture and breath long before words revealed it. When Clara rose to order tea, the note slipped partially from her glove. Miss Marple noticed faint handwriting along its edge, hurried and uneven. Clara retrieved it quickly, though not before Miss Marple glimpsed the words "tonight" and "after rehearsal." Clara returned to her table and began tearing the paper into small pieces beneath the tablecloth. Later, when she left, Miss Marple happened to pass the fireplace where discarded scraps had been tossed. One fragment had escaped the flames. She did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she waited until Mrs. Harmon turned away, then retrieved it casually. Only a few words remained visible. Behind the curtain. Miss Marple placed the scrap into her handbag with quiet thoughtfulness. Outside, village life continued peacefully, children cycling past, shop bells ringing, distant church bells marking the hour. Yet Miss Marple felt the gentle certainty that calm surfaces often hid complicated undercurrents. She decided upon a short walk before returning home, choosing a path that passed near Rosebank Hall. The house appeared serene in afternoon light, though activity stirred near the side entrance. Gerald Ashcombe stood speaking with a delivery man beside a motor car. His laughter carried easily across the lawn, confident and charming. Yet when the delivery man mentioned accounts needing signatures, Gerald's expression hardened briefly before he forced another smile. "I'll see to it," he said quickly. Miss Marple paused near the hedge, pretending interest in winter roses. Gerald did not notice her, but she observed ink stains again upon his cuffs, darker today, recently made. Curious stains for a gentleman supposedly uninterested in paperwork. As she continued walking, she reflected upon Eleanor's anxiety, legal discussions, hidden notes, and altered theater props. None alone suggested wrongdoing, yet together they formed a pattern, one still incomplete but increasingly distinct. That evening rehearsal resumed with renewed energy. The green room buzzed with excitement, though Miss Marple sensed tension beneath the laughter. Clara avoided Gerald entirely, positioning herself carefully across the room whenever he approached. Gerald, for his part, appeared unusually attentive to Eleanor, offering assistance she politely declined. Miss Marple seated herself quietly near the mirror, observing reflections rather than direct interactions. Mirrors, she often thought, revealed truth because people forgot to perform for them. Mrs. Linton soon resumed gossip, remarking loudly that charity events always revealed who truly cared about appearances. Eleanor smiled politely, but said little, her attention fixed again upon the stage curtain. During rehearsal, a small mishap occurred when a prop table was discovered missing from its marked position. A stagehand insisted it had been moved after closing the previous night. Eleanor grew visibly unsettled, insisting everything must remain exactly arranged. "It is important," she said firmly, then softened her tone. For timing. Miss Marple noted the emphasis. Timing mattered greatly, not merely for theater, perhaps. Later, during a scene break, Miss Marple walked slowly along the edge of the stage. She noticed faint scuff marks near the curtain ropes, fresh against older wood. Someone had stood there repeatedly, shifting weight while waiting. Gerald joined her unexpectedly. "Enjoying the performance, Miss Marple?" he asked pleasantly. "Very much," she replied, "though I confess I find rehearsals more interesting than performances." He laughed lightly. "Because of the mistakes?" "Because people forget to pretend," she said gently. For a moment, his smile faltered. Then, he excused himself quickly, returning backstage. The rehearsal concluded late. Actors gathered belongings while Eleanor spoke quietly with Mr. Pike near the stage entrance. Their conversation appeared tense. Eleanor held a document tightly, while Mr. Pike shook his head anxiously. Miss Marple pretended to examine costume embroidery while listening. "Must be finalized," Eleanor said softly. "It could cause difficulty," Mr. Pike replied. "It must be done," she insisted. Their voices dropped further, ending discussion as Gerald approached. Eleanor folded the document immediately and placed it inside her bag. As villagers departed into the cool evening, Clara lingered behind, clearly waiting for someone. Miss Marple observed from the doorway as the girl glanced repeatedly toward the curtain. At last, she seemed to lose courage and hurried out alone. Moments later, Gerald slipped quietly back toward the stage. Miss Marple paused in the corridor, adjusting her gloves slowly. She heard faint movement behind the curtain, the soft rustle of fabric, followed by a muted exclamation quickly silenced. Then stillness. Gerald emerged seconds later, looking composed but pale. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Miss Marple. "Still here?" he asked. "I walk slowly at night," she replied pleasantly. He nodded and left without further conversation. Miss Marple stepped closer to the curtain once he was gone. The heavy velvet hung perfectly still, yet she sensed recent disturbance. Her fingers brushed the seam lightly, feeling a faint unevenness beneath the fabric, as though something had once been hidden there and recently removed or adjusted. She withdrew her hand at once, thoughtful rather than alarmed. Outside, the sky deepened into quiet darkness. Mrs. Bantry chatted cheerfully beside her, unaware of Miss Marple's growing certainty that the theater concealed more than amateur ambition. As they walked home, Miss Marple considered the torn note, the altered arrangements, the solicitor's anxiety, and Eleanor's determination. Someone feared exposure. Someone else feared discovery even more. And as the lamps of Rosebank Hall faded behind them, Miss Marple felt the unmistakable sense that whatever meeting had been planned behind the curtain had not yet reached its conclusion, and that before the final performance, something far more serious than embarrassment would demand its entrance onto the stage. Chapter 4. People often believed that rehearsals grew calmer as opening night approached, yet Miss Marple had long observed the opposite to be true. The nearer a performance came, the more carefully people guarded their composure, and the more noticeable the smallest cracks became. On the evening of the final rehearsal at Rosebank Hall, an odd stillness seemed to settle over St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself sensed anticipation it could not quite explain. Mrs. Bantry remarked cheerfully that everyone appeared unusually serious for an amateur play, and Miss Marple agreed with a gentle smile, though privately she thought seriousness rarely appeared without reason. Inside the hall, lamps glowed warmly against polished wood, casting long shadows that softened imperfections. Actors moved with rehearsed confidence now, yet their laughter sounded slightly forced, rising too quickly and fading too soon. Miss Marple took her usual seat near the side aisle, perfectly positioned to observe both audience and stage entrances. She noticed immediately that Eleanor Ashcombe was already present, standing beside the curtain ropes long before anyone else arrived. Eleanor examined the mechanism herself, running her fingers carefully along each cord, testing tension with quiet precision. A stagehand offered assistance, but she declined with polite firmness. "I prefer to be certain," she said, smiling faintly. The remark might have seemed harmless, yet Miss Marple noted the strain beneath it. Eleanor was not checking theatrical details, she was reassuring herself of something unseen. Gerald arrived shortly afterward, energetic and charming as ever. He greeted everyone warmly, though his eyes moved quickly toward Eleanor and then toward the curtain. For a brief moment, irritation crossed his face when he saw her inspecting it again. He approached, speaking in a low voice. "You really must leave these things to the staff," he said lightly. "I find it calming," Eleanor replied. Her tone ended the conversation, though Gerald's smile lingered a fraction too long after he turned away. Rehearsal began with renewed determination. Lines flowed smoothly, cues followed in proper order, and applause broke out jokingly after successful scenes. Yet Miss Marple sensed attention divided. Several actors glanced repeatedly toward backstage, rather than focusing on performance. Clara Bennett missed a cue entirely when Eleanor stepped briefly behind the curtain, her distraction obvious even to the audience. During a lighting adjustment, the hall darkened unexpectedly. For several seconds, the stage remained in shadow. In that moment, Miss Marple heard movement, not hurried, but deliberate, crossing the boards behind the curtain when no actor was meant to be present. When lights returned, Eleanor emerged looking unsettled, though she quickly composed herself. "Only checking placement," she explained to no one in particular. Miss Marple watched quietly. Fear, she reflected, rarely vanished so quickly unless concealed by necessity. Tea was served during the interval. Conversations clustered into familiar groups, gossip flowing more freely now that opening night approached. Mrs. Linton declared loudly that theatrical productions revealed people's true natures. "Put anyone under pressure," she said, "and secrets appear." The remark caused Clara to lower her gaze. Gerald laughed, though he did not respond. Mr. Pike stood near the refreshment table, speaking to Eleanor with visible unease. "I still advise caution," he murmured. "It cannot wait," Eleanor replied firmly. Miss Marple pretended interest in sugar tongs while listening. The solicitor's shoulders sagged slightly, as though burdened by responsibility he wished to avoid. Rehearsal resumed with a complicated scene change involving full curtain closure. Eleanor insisted on supervising again, standing beside the mechanism while stagehands operated it. The heavy velvet descended smoothly at first, then hesitated midway with a faint tearing sound. The hall fell silent. The curtain jerked unevenly before settling. A narrow gap revealed darkness behind it. Eleanor stepped forward instantly, drawing the fabric closed herself with surprising urgency. "Nothing at all," she said quickly. "Only old stitching." Yet her hands trembled slightly. After rehearsal paused, a stagehand examined the curtain lining. Miss Marple wandered closer under the pretense of curiosity. The lining had separated just enough to reveal something unusual, a concealed inner fold stitched carefully along the seam. "Strange workmanship," the stagehand muttered. "Not original." He reached inside but withdrew an empty hand. "There's a pocket here," he added. Something was kept inside. Eleanor turned sharply. "Surely not," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple observed everyone present. Clara appeared startled. Mr. Pike adjusted his spectacles nervously. Gerald alone remained very still, his expression carefully neutral. The pocket was empty, yet the fabric bore the clear outline of papers recently removed. Rehearsal ended early afterward, Eleanor insisting everyone rest before opening night. Villagers gathered belongings with subdued conversation. The cheerful mood had faded, replaced by quiet speculation. Miss Marple lingered near the stage while others departed. She noticed Gerald watching the curtain from across the hall, his gaze calculating rather than curious. When he realized he was observed, he smiled pleasantly and began discussing lighting arrangements with exaggerated enthusiasm. Outside, dusk deepened into evening. Mrs. Bantry spoke animatedly about costumes again, though even she admitted something felt peculiar. Miss Marple agreed gently, remarking that anticipation sometimes made people behave oddly. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple realized she had forgotten her gloves and returned briefly inside. The hall stood nearly empty now, lamps dimmed, shadows stretching across the stage. From behind the curtain came hushed voices. She paused instinctively. Eleanor's voice sounded firm but strained. "You must understand, it ends tomorrow," Gerald replied, his tone sharper than she had yet heard. "You're making a mistake. I will not change my mind." Silence followed, heavy and unresolved. Miss Marple stepped deliberately so her footsteps would be heard. The conversation ceased immediately. Eleanor emerged moments later, composed but pale. Gerald followed, smiling as though nothing unusual had occurred. "Still here, Miss Marple?" he asked pleasantly. "I walk slowly," she replied with equal calm. They exchanged polite goodnights. Yet as Miss Marple turned toward the exit, she heard a faint rustling behind the curtain once more. The sound of fabric disturbed after being carefully arranged. Outside, the night air felt cool and still. Stars appeared faintly above Rosebank Hall, peaceful and indifferent. Mrs. Bantry chatted beside her, unaware of Miss Marple's deepening thoughts. A hidden pocket, recently emptied. Arguments about documents. Fear disguised as theatrical concern. And now urgency. The sense that a decision had already been made, one that could not easily be undone. Miss Marple folded her hands together as they walked down the path. She felt increasingly certain that whatever had once been hidden within that curtain had held great importance, important enough to frighten Eleanor Ashcombe, and perhaps important enough for someone else to risk everything to obtain it. And as the hall lights dimmed behind them, Miss Marple found herself wondering not who had removed the hidden papers, but why Eleanor had waited until now to act, and whether tomorrow's performance would reveal far more than any audience expected when the curtain finally rose. Chapter 5. Opening night in St. Mary Mead always arrived with an air of celebration that felt almost ceremonial. Yet Miss Marple sensed from the very beginning that this evening carried a different quality, a brightness slightly too polished, like laughter sustained a moment longer than comfort allowed. The first whisper reached her before she even left her cottage, carried by Mrs. Finch at the garden gate, who declared that half the village had already gathered at Rosebank Hall and that Mrs. Ashcombe looked quite worn, poor dear, despite insisting everything was perfectly arranged. Miss Marple thanked her kindly and continued on her way, reflecting that people most determined to appear calm were often those enduring the greatest strain. Rosebank Hall shone warmly against the darkening sky, lanterns illuminating the entrance while carriages and motor cars arrived in steady succession. Voices mingled with excitement, silk rustled, and the scent of evening air blended with polished wood and perfume. Villagers greeted one another with festive enthusiasm, though Miss Marple noticed how conversation repeatedly returned to Eleanor Ashcombe, her generosity, her effort, her unusual seriousness during recent days. Inside, the hall buzzed with anticipation. Programs fluttered in eager hands while late arrivals searched for seats. Mrs. Bantry waved enthusiastically from the second row, saving a place beside her. Miss Marple settled comfortably, observing rather than participating. She noticed immediately that Gerald Ashcombe moved briskly between guests, smiling and charming, yet his attention remained fixed upon backstage entrances. Each time the curtain shifted slightly, his gaze sharpened. The curtain itself appeared magnificent under stage lighting, its crimson folds rich and theatrical. Yet Miss Marple felt an odd sensation while looking at it, the faint impression that it concealed not merely scenery, but expectation, as though something waited behind it with quiet patience. Backstage activity created subtle disturbances audible even from the audience. A drop prop, hurried footsteps, whispers quickly silenced. Clara Bennet peeked briefly through the curtain gap, her expression pale, before she forced a performer's smile and disappeared again. Mrs. Bantry leaned close. "Nerves," she whispered cheerfully. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Nerves often accompany important moments." The performance began with enthusiastic applause. Actors delivered lines with admirable determination, laughter rising at appropriate moments. Yet Miss Marple found her attention drawn less to dialogue and more to behavior at the edges of the stage. Eleanor stood just within the wings during the first act, watching intently rather than enjoying the audience's reaction. She clasped her hands tightly, releasing them only when applause reassured her. During a scene change, Gerald slipped backstage despite having no entrance scheduled. Miss Marple noticed Clara's voice falter briefly moments later, recovering only after a noticeable pause. A small detail, perhaps, yet such interruptions rarely occurred without cause. The first act concluded successfully. Audience members praised costumes and scenery, while refreshments were quietly prepared at the rear of the hall. Eleanor appeared on stage to offer brief thanks for community support. Her speech was gracious, though Miss Marple observed exhaustion beneath her composure. "After tonight," Eleanor said, smiling warmly, "certain matters will finally be set right." The remark passed unnoticed by most listeners, interpreted as theatrical sentiment. Miss Marple, however, noted Gerald's sudden stillness at the side of the stage. His smile faded almost imperceptibly before returning with practiced ease. During the interval, Miss Marple moved slowly toward the refreshment table. Conversations flowed freely. "I hear Miss Ashcombe plans announcements soon," Mrs. Linton murmured nearby. "Financial arrangements, perhaps," another replied. Mr. Pike stood apart, visibly uneasy. When Miss Marple greeted him, he responded politely but distractedly, glancing repeatedly toward backstage corridors. "Important evening," she remarked gently. "Yes," he said after a pause. "Very important indeed." His tone carried apprehension rather than celebration. The bell rang, calling everyone back to seats. As the second act began, lighting dimmed, and the curtain rose smoothly. For several minutes, all proceeded normally. Then, midway through a dramatic moment, the curtain descended prematurely with a heavy sweep, startling audience and actors alike. A murmur spread across the hall. Stagehands rushed forward, whispering urgently. After a brief delay, the curtain rose again, the play continuing with forced composure. Miss Marple noticed Eleanor was no longer visible at the wing. A subtle unease settled over her. Moments later, a figure hurried across the side aisle, Clara Bennett, pale and shaken, whispering urgently to Gerald. He disappeared behind the curtain at once. The audience assumed a theatrical adjustment, yet tension spread quietly among performers. The scene concluded awkwardly, applause hesitant. Then the curtain fell again, this time deliberately. Whispers grew louder. Mrs. Bantry frowned. That wasn't scheduled. Miss Marple remained still, listening. Behind the curtain came hurried footsteps, low voices, and the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping across wooden boards. Time stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Mr. Pike appeared at the edge of the stage, speaking quietly with a stage manager whose expression looked deeply troubled. The curtain rose only halfway. Gerald stepped forward, pale but composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "a brief delay. Nothing to concern you." His reassurance sounded practiced, too swift. Miss Marple watched closely. His eyes avoided the audience entirely. Several minutes passed before murmurs intensified. At last, Mrs. Bantry grasped Miss Marple's arm. "Something has happened," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded gently. She had already reached the same conclusion. Then, the curtain lifted fully. The stage stood empty except for a small cluster of figures gathered near the wings. Eleanor Ashcombe sat in a chair, her posture unnaturally still. A glass lay overturned beside her, liquid staining the floorboards. Clara stood nearby, trembling, while Mr. Pike spoke urgently to a servant sent running for assistance. No dramatic collapse, no theatrical gesture, only stillness. The audience gradually realized the performance had stopped for reasons beyond rehearsal mishap. Voices lowered instinctively, respect replacing curiosity. Gerald moved quickly forward again. "Miss Ashcombe has taken unwell," he said. "We must ask for your patience." His words sounded rehearsed, almost prepared. Miss Marple observed Eleanor carefully from her seat. The woman's face appeared peaceful, yet something about the scene troubled her deeply. The chair's position suggested Eleanor had sat willingly, not fallen. The overturned glass lay just beyond easy reach, as though released rather than dropped during struggle. No disturbance surrounded her, only quiet finality. Audience members were gently escorted outside, while confusion spread through whispered speculation. Mrs. Bantry expressed concern, but Miss Marple walked calmly toward the exit, her mind already arranging details. As she passed near the stage, she noticed Gerald speaking urgently to Mr. Pike. "She's been unwell for weeks," Gerald insisted in a low voice. "You know that." Mr. Pike did not reply immediately. Miss Marple continued walking, though the remark settled firmly in her thoughts. It had been offered too quickly, before questions were even asked. Outside, night air felt suddenly colder. Villagers gathered in anxious groups, exchanging theories and reassurances. Some spoke of exhaustion, others of fainting. Yet uncertainty lingered. Miss Marple glanced back toward the hall windows, glowing against darkness. Behind those curtains, she felt certain, the true drama had only just begun. A servant hurried past carrying a sealed envelope case, now noticeably empty. Miss Marple recognized it faintly from Eleanor's earlier possession during rehearsals. Empty. She folded her hands thoughtfully. The curtain, the hidden pocket, the arguments, the documents, and now Eleanor Ashcombe sitting quietly behind the stage where few witnesses stood. As Mrs. Bantry spoke anxiously beside her, Miss Marple felt a gentle but unmistakable certainty settle in her mind. This had not been sudden illness nor unfortunate coincidence. Something deliberate had occurred at the precise moment when Eleanor intended to set matters right. And as the doors of Rosebank Hall closed behind them, shutting away the unfinished play and its silent stage, Miss Marple realized that the evening's performance had ended exactly where another story, far darker and far more carefully arranged, had begun its final act. Chapter 6. The morning after the interrupted performance arrived with an unnatural quiet, as though Saint Mary Mead had collectively decided to speak more softly out of respect for events it did not yet understand. Curtains remained half-drawn in cottage windows, conversations occurred in lowered voices, and even the church bells seemed gentler than usual. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a modest breakfast tray untouched beside her, listened to the distant murmur of villagers passing along the lane. Grief had settled over the village, but beneath it stirred curiosity, that inevitable companion to sudden misfortune. Mrs. Bantry arrived before noon, carrying news with visible restraint that lasted precisely 3 minutes. "They say Miss Ashcombe passed away shortly after being taken upstairs," she said quietly. "So very sudden. Gerald insists her health had been fragile." Miss Marple poured tea carefully before replying. People often describe events as sudden when they do not wish to explain them. Mrs. Bantry sighed, recognizing the familiar tone that meant Miss Marple's mind was already engaged. The two sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the ticking clock filling space between them. "I cannot help feeling," Mrs. Bantry added, "that everyone behaved rather oddly last night." Miss Marple agreed gently. "Yes, grief reveals character, but so does fear." By afternoon, social obligation required calls of sympathy, and Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Bantry to Rosebank Hall. The house felt altered immediately upon entry. Curtains were partially drawn, footsteps subdued, voices careful. Servants moved quietly, avoiding eye contact, as though uncertainty lingered in every corridor. Gerald received visitors in the drawing room, dressed in dark attire that suited his composed expression. He spoke with controlled sorrow, thanking guests politely. Yet Miss Marple noticed how he repeated certain phrases with striking consistency. "My aunt had not been well," he said again and again. The strain of organizing everything was simply too much. Each repetition sounded practiced, refined through use. When Miss Marple expressed condolences, Gerald inclined his head gratefully. "A terrible shock," she said softly. "Yes," he replied quickly. Though perhaps not entirely unexpected, the remark arrived too readily. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, but filed it away carefully. Mr. Henry Pike soon joined them, looking exhausted. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggested a sleepless night. When conversation turned toward Eleanor's affairs, he grew visibly uncomfortable. "There are formalities to address," he said. "Matters of estate management." "Miss Ashcombe was very conscientious," Miss Marple observed. "Indeed," he replied, then hesitated. "She had recently made certain revisions." Gerald's gaze sharpened instantly. "Legal details can wait," he interrupted lightly. The interruption felt gentle but deliberate. Mr. Pike fell silent at once. Miss Marple noticed the exchange without appearing to do so. She asked instead about the success of the performance preparations, allowing conversation to drift toward harmless topics. Yet beneath politeness, she sensed tension stretching tightly between the two men. After tea, Miss Marple requested permission to walk briefly in the garden. Gerald agreed readily, perhaps relieved to escape discussion. Outside, autumn air carried faint traces of stage paint drifting from an open window near the theater wing. Miss Marple wandered slowly toward it. Inside, stagehands quietly restored order after the previous evening's chaos. Props were returned, chairs aligned, and the great curtain hung motionless once more. Its stillness felt almost solemn. A young servant passed carrying costume pieces and greeted Miss Marple nervously. "Such a dreadful evening," he said. "I was just outside the stage when it happened." "Oh?" Miss Marple replied kindly. "Yes, miss. I heard voices before Miss Ashcombe sat down. Someone arguing. Not loudly, but sharp-like. Did you recognize the voices?" He hesitated. "One was hers. The other, I couldn't be sure." Miss Marple thanked him gently and continued walking, her thoughts deepening. Inside the theater space, she noticed something new. The small table used backstage had been moved closer to the curtain than before. Upon it rested several glasses awaiting removal. One position remained empty, marked by a faint circular stain on the wood. She leaned slightly closer, The stain suggested recent liquid, wiped hastily but not completely. A stagehand approached apologetically. "We're clearing everything today." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "A busy task after excitement? Yes, miss. Though funny thing, the cordial bottle from last night has gone missing. We thought someone packed it by mistake." Miss Marple smiled mildly. Theater produces many confusions, yet inwardly she considered the details significant. As she turned away, her eye caught a small object near the curtain rope, a key lying partly hidden beneath coiled fabric. She picked it up carefully. "A study key," the stagehand explained. "Miss Ashcombe kept a duplicate," they said. "Not sure how it ended up here." Miss Marple examined it briefly before handing it back. A duplicate key among theater props suggested hurried concealment rather than accident. Later, inside the house again, she encountered Clara Bennet seated alone in the morning room. The girl looked pale, her eyes shadowed by worry. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you must rest after such strain." Clara nodded but spoke hesitantly. "Miss Ashcombe planned to announce something after the play." "Oh?" "She told me only that everything would be settled once the performance ended." Clara swallowed. She seemed relieved, almost hopeful. "Did she meet anyone backstage before she became unwell?" Clara hesitated, then nodded faintly. "I heard raised voices behind the curtain. I thought it was rehearsal discussion. I didn't want to intrude." Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Miss Marple changed the subject kindly, sensing the girl's distress had reached its limit. Yet Clara's words aligned too closely with other fragments Miss Marple had gathered. Before leaving, Miss Marple passed once more through the drawing room where Gerald and Mr. Pike stood in subdued conversation. Gerald stopped speaking immediately upon seeing her. "Such difficult days," she said warmly. "Yes," Gerald replied, "but matters must move forward." His tone held determination rather than sorrow. Outside, Mrs. Bantry asked whether Miss Marple believed Eleanor's death entirely natural. Miss Marple considered before answering. "I believe," she said softly, "that people sometimes rely upon politeness to prevent questions." They walked slowly down the path as afternoon light faded. Miss Marple reviewed each detail carefully. The repeated claim of illness, the missing cordial bottle, the duplicate key hidden among props, arguments overheard, documents altered, and Eleanor's intention to make an announcement. Individually, they remained small matters. Together, they suggested design. Someone had needed Eleanor silent before she spoke publicly. Someone familiar with backstage routines. Someone prepared to guide the narrative immediately afterward. As evening approached, Miss Marple paused at the village crossroads, watching Rosebank Hall in the distance. Smoke rose peacefully from its chimneys, giving no outward sign of turmoil within. Yet she felt increasingly certain that the truth did not lie hidden in secrecy at all, but rather in behavior, in words repeated too often, grief expressed too carefully, and explanations offered before questions formed. And as she turned toward home, Miss Marple realized that whoever had arranged events behind the curtain believed the matter already concluded, unaware that quiet observation, once begun, rarely abandoned its pursuit until every polite lie had gently, inevitably, come undone. Chapter 7. There are moments in village life when grief slowly gives way to curiosity, and curiosity, if guided gently enough, becomes revelation. A few days after Eleanor Ashcombe's passing, St. Mary Mead had entered precisely such a stage. Mourning remained outwardly proper, yet conversations lingered longer than necessary. Questions slipped into otherwise ordinary remarks, and visitors to Rosebank Hall arrived as much to observe one another as to offer sympathy. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in her drawing room that morning, considered that truth rarely emerged through confrontation. It preferred instead the familiar comfort of tea and polite company. Accordingly, she sent several invitations. By late afternoon, Rosebank Hall's smaller sitting room hosted an intimate gathering arranged under the agreeable excuse of discussing the unfinished charity arrangements. Mrs. Bantry attended eagerly, along with Mr. Henry Pike, Clara Bennet, Mrs. Linton, and finally Gerald Ashcombe himself, who appeared mildly surprised but perfectly courteous. Miss Marple had suggested the meeting gently, explaining that Eleanor would surely have wished the village effort completed harmoniously. No one could object to such reasoning. Tea was served beside tall windows overlooking the quiet garden. Autumn lights softened the room, creating an atmosphere almost too peaceful for serious discussion. Miss Marple allowed conversation to begin naturally. Mrs. Linton spoke first, remarking how unfortunate it was that Eleanor's plans remained unfinished. She always believed in proper conclusions, Mrs. Linton said. One dislikes loose ends. Indeed, Miss Marple replied mildly. Loose ends have a habit of troubling people. She noticed Gerald shift slightly in his chair. Mr. Pike cleared his throat. There are legal matters yet unresolved, he admitted reluctantly. Miss Ashcombe revised certain documents shortly before her death. Gerald smiled faintly. Administrative adjustments, I imagine. Mr. Pike hesitated. Not entirely. The room grew quieter. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully before speaking again. Miss Ashcombe seemed very determined during rehearsals. I remember she said matters would be set right after the performance. Clara looked up quickly. Yes. She told me something similar. Gerald's smile tightened. My aunt often dramatized ordinary decisions. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, though she also appeared relieved. The word lingered. Mrs. Bantry added innocently, she spent an extraordinary amount of time watching the curtain, didn't she? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, almost as though something important rested there. Gerald laughed softly. Surely we are not discussing stage decor as though it were mysterious? No, Miss Marple said kindly. Not decor. Only human behavior. She allowed silence to settle before continuing. I understand, she said conversationally, that a hidden pocket was discovered inside the curtain lining. Mr. Pike looked startled. Clara glanced toward Gerald instinctively. Yes, Miss Marple continued calmly. A curious alteration. Recently emptied, I believe. Gerald leaned back, crossing his arms. Theater people do odd things. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed. Yet Miss Ashcombe argued with someone shortly before the performance. Several people heard raised voices. Clara spoke quietly. I heard them behind the curtain. Gerald's gaze flicked toward her sharply. Miss Marple's tone remained warm, almost apologetic. Miss Ashcombe had also discovered financial irregularities connected with Rosebank Hall's accounts. Mr. Pike closed his eyes briefly, as though resignation had finally arrived. I failed to notice the pattern soon enough, he admitted. Funds were redirected through theatrical expenses. Signatures appeared legitimate, but were not. Miss Marple finished gently. Gerald rose halfway from his seat. This is absurd. Miss Marple looked at him kindly, almost sympathetically. My dear Mr. Ashcombe, deception often relies upon familiarity. Only someone trusted could move freely backstage, adjust props, and access documents without suspicion. No one spoke. She continued, her voice calm and reflective, as though recounting a simple domestic puzzle. The hidden pocket contained evidence, papers Miss Ashcombe intended to reveal after the play. She delayed action until opening night so the announcement would occur publicly, preventing quiet denial. Mr. Pike nodded faintly. She told me she wished everything witnessed. Gerald's composure faltered slightly. Speculation. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Not speculation. Observation. You were seen behind the curtain repeatedly. You insisted upon her illness before anyone suggested otherwise. And most telling of all, the poisoned cordial was prepared backstage during the blackout rehearsal, when movement went unnoticed. Clara gasped softly. Miss Marple continued with quiet certainty. Miss Ashcombe refused to remain silent. During the performance interval, you confronted her, hoping persuasion would succeed. When it did not, you used opportunity provided by theatrical confusion. A small addition to her drink required no struggle, no scene, only timing. Gerald's voice hardened. You have no proof. Miss Marple smiled gently. Proof often lies in knowledge one should not possess. You told Mr. Pike she had been unwell before anyone examined her. You removed the documents from the curtain pocket beforehand, believing their absence would end suspicion. Mr. Pike looked toward Gerald with dawning understanding. The forged instructions came through my office, he said quietly, but always delivered by you. Silence filled the room completely now. Gerald's confident charm faded, replaced by something colder. She would have ruined everything, he said at last. The estate was failing. I merely adjusted matters. Miss Marple regarded him with sadness rather than triumph. You believed yourself practical. Yet Miss Ashcombe valued honesty more than comfort. Clara covered her mouth, shocked. Gerald sank slowly into his chair, composure dissolving. The careful mask he had worn throughout the week finally slipped away. Outside, a distant bird call broke the stillness. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. Human nature is remarkably consistent. People imagine elaborate solutions, yet overlook small details, a tone spoken too quickly, a fear shown at the wrong moment, a curtain watched too closely. No accusation remained in her voice, only quiet conclusion. Mr. Pike rose heavily. I shall inform the authorities. Gerald did not protest. His silence spoke more clearly than denial. The gathering ended slowly, guests departing in subdued reflection. Mrs. Bantry lingered beside Miss Marple as evening light faded through the windows. My dear Jane, she whispered, you noticed everything. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not everything. Only what people revealed themselves. She glanced toward the distant theater wing, where the curtain now hung motionless, its secret finally understood. Yet as calm returned to Rosebank Hall, Miss Marple felt one final certainty settle gently in her mind, that truth, once uncovered, did not merely explain the past, but restored balance to the present. And as the shadows lengthened across the quiet garden, she knew the final act of this tragedy remained to be spoken aloud, where denial would end and the curtain would fall for the last time. Chapter 8. The following evening carried a strange sense of calm over Rosebank Hall, the kind that arrived only after tension had stretched too far and finally released its hold. Lamps glowed softly in the drawing room, and the familiar arrangement of chairs suggested ordinary village civility, yet everyone present understood that something final was about to occur. Word had spread quietly that Miss Marple wished to clarify certain matters regarding Eleanor Ashcombe's last evening. In St. Mary Mead, such invitations were never ignored. The same small circle gathered once more, Mrs. Bantry seated attentively near the fireplace, Mr. Henry Pike grave and silent, Clara Bennet pale but resolute, and Gerald Ashcombe standing near the mantel with an air of strained patience. Outside, dusk settled gently over the gardens, the theater wing visible through tall windows, its darkened stage waiting like a silent witness. Miss Marple sat comfortably with her teacup, appearing almost apologetic for the attention directed toward her. She allowed conversation to begin naturally, discussing Eleanor's generosity and the unfortunate interruption of the charity performance. Only when the room settled into expectant quiet did she speak more deliberately. It seems to me, she began gently, that Rosebank Hall has always resembled a theater in more ways than one. People played their roles beautifully. Kindness, loyalty, responsibility, yet behind the curtain, entirely different anxieties unfolded. Gerald sighed faintly. Must we continue this? Miss Marple smiled kindly, only briefly. I believe Miss Ashcombe would have preferred clarity. She placed her cup aside. Miss Ashcombe discovered that funds were disappearing from her estate. Not dramatically at first, small adjustments hidden within theatrical expenses and renovation accounts. Such changes require access, familiarity, and trust. Mr. Pike lowered his gaze. The instructions reached my office properly signed. I had no reason to question them. Of course not, Miss Marple said, because the deception depended upon appearing ordinary. She turned slightly toward Gerald, her tone still warm. You were trusted completely. You organized rehearsals, managed deliveries, and moved freely between house and theater. No one questioned your presence backstage. Gerald's expression hardened, though he remained silent. Miss Ashcombe gathered proof. Miss Marple continued. Rather cleverly, she hid the documents within the curtain lining, a place both symbolic and practical. She intended to reveal them publicly after the performance, ensuring the truth could not quietly disappear. Clara whispered. She told me everything would be settled that night. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. She believed exposure would end the matter without scandal. She paused, allowing the room to absorb the thought. But you discovered the hiding place, she said gently to Gerald. You searched behind the curtain during rehearsals. The hidden pocket was emptied before opening night. Gerald spoke sharply. Circumstantial observations. Miss Marple inclined her head. Perhaps, yet your behavior afterward completed the pattern. You argued with Miss Ashcombe shortly before the performance. Several people heard raised voices. She refused to remain silent. The room felt very still. During the blackout rehearsal, Miss Marple continued. You learned how easily confusion concealed movement backstage. On opening night, when the interval created distraction, you added poison to her cordial. No struggle, no spectacle, only quiet certainty. Clara closed her eyes briefly, remembering. You believed the chaos of performance would disguise everything, Miss Marple said. And for a moment, it nearly did. Mr. Pike spoke hoarsely. The missing bottle. Removed afterward, Miss Marple said. Just as the documents had been. Gerald laughed once, though the sound held no amusement. You make it sound theatrical. Human actions often are, Miss Marple replied gently. Especially when motivated by desperation, she folded her hands calmly. You insisted immediately that your aunt had been unwell. That was the detail that troubled me most. People rarely prepare explanations unless they anticipate questions. Gerald's composure faltered. His gaze moved around the room, finding no ally. She would have destroyed everything, he said finally, voice low. The estate was failing. I only meant to secure what should have been mine. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet compassion rather than accusation. You mistook possession for security. Miss Ashcombe valued honesty above comfort. She believed truth could repair what deception could not. Silence followed, heavy yet strangely peaceful, as though uncertainty itself had ended. Mr. Pike stood slowly. I will contact the authorities tonight. Gerald did not resist. The tension drained from him, replaced by weary resignation. He sank into a chair, the confidence that once defined him completely gone. Outside, the wind stirred faintly through the garden trees, brushing softly against the theater windows. Miss Marple rose and walked slowly toward them. Through the glass, she could see the stage beyond, empty and dim, the great curtain hanging motionless once more. For a moment, she seemed lost in reflection. Theater teaches us something rather useful, she said quietly. Every performance ends. No matter how convincing the illusion, the curtain must eventually fall. Mrs. Bantry joined her, sighing softly. Poor Eleanor, yes, Miss Marple said. She trusted that truth, once revealed, would restore balance. And in a way, it has. Later, as guests departed and the house grew quiet again, Miss Marple stepped briefly into the theater itself. Lamps cast gentle pools of light across wooden boards where laughter and tragedy had mingled only days before. She approached the curtain and touched the heavy velvet lightly. It no longer concealed secrets. Only silence remained. She imagined Eleanor standing there days earlier, determined yet hopeful, believing honesty would prevail. The thought carried sadness, but also admiration. Behind her, footsteps approached, Mrs. Bantry waiting patiently. Well, her friend said softly, everything is finished at last. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes. The play ended rather differently than expected. They walked toward the exit together. As the lights dimmed, the stage faded into shadow, peaceful once again. Outside, night air felt calm and reassuring, the village returning slowly to familiar rhythms. And as Rosebank Hall settled into stillness, Miss Marple reflected that human vanity often believed itself clever enough to rewrite endings. Yet truth, like the final curtain, arrived inevitably, closing gently but decisively upon deception, leaving behind only quiet understanding and the certainty that even the smallest observation, patiently kept, could bring darkness into the light at last. The days that followed restored St. Mary Mead to its familiar rhythm, though a softness lingered in conversation whenever Rosebank Hall was mentioned. Village life possessed a remarkable ability to continue. Gardens still required tending, letters still arrived with morning post, and the church bells rang each Sunday exactly as they always had. Yet beneath this ordinary routine remained the quiet awareness that something significant had passed through their peaceful community and left it subtly changed. Rosebank Hall stood calmer now. The theater doors remained closed for several weeks, allowing dust to settle upon the stage where excitement and sorrow had shared the same evening. Volunteers eventually returned to tidy costumes and store props, speaking gently as though unwilling to disturb lingering memories. The great curtain hung motionless, its folds no longer watched with fear, but regarded with respectful silence. Miss Marple visited one afternoon at Mrs. Bantry's insistence, walking slowly through the hall with her usual thoughtful composure. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating familiar corners that seemed smaller without tension inhabiting them. Clara Bennet had resumed her cheerful manner, though maturity now softened her youthful excitement. Mr. Pike worked diligently to restore Eleanor Ashcombe's affairs, determined that honesty should guide every decision henceforth. The village spoke kindly of Eleanor. Stories emerged, her generosity, her quiet determination, her belief that dignity mattered even in difficulty. Gradually, grief transformed into remembrance, and remembrance into gratitude. As for Gerald Ashcombe, discussion faded quickly. St. Mary Mead preferred resolution over scandal. People shook their heads sadly and concluded that ambition, when mixed with fear, often led otherwise ordinary individuals into regrettable choices. Miss Marple never spoke harshly of him. She believed wrongdoing rarely began with cruelty, more often it began with small compromises repeated until conscience grew silent. One evening, as autumn deepened into early winter, Miss Marple sat beside her window with tea warming her hands. Mrs. Bantry visited, eager as always for reflection now that excitement had passed. "You saw it all long before anyone else," Mrs. Bantry said admiringly. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not at all. I merely noticed what everyone else noticed. Only I did not look away when it seemed uncomfortable." She gazed toward the fading light beyond the garden. "People reveal themselves constantly," she continued softly. "In small hesitations, in words spoken too quickly, in fears they cannot quite conceal. One only needs patience." Outside, the evening settled peacefully over St. Mary Mead. Smoke rose from chimneys, and distant laughter drifted along the lane. Life, steady and reassuring, continued exactly as it should. Miss Marple reflected that the tragedy at Rosebank Hall had never truly been about money or inheritance. It had been about trust, how easily it could be misplaced, and how quietly it could be restored when truth emerged at last. Eleanor Ashcombe had believed honesty would prevail, and in the end, it had. She lifted her teacup, smiling faintly to herself. Some mysteries ended with dramatic revelations, but others concluded more gently, leaving behind understanding rather than shock. The curtain had fallen, the performance finished, and peace returned to the village stage. And in the quiet comfort of her chair, Miss Marple felt certain that while human nature would always provide new puzzles, kindness and careful observation would continue, as they always had, to bring light where shadows once believed themselves safely hidden.